What if everything you knew about the most glorious reign in European history was a lie? What if the dazzling brilliance of the Sun King's court, a spectacle of unparalleled power and opulence, was hiding a secret so dark, so monstrous, that it would rewrite the history books? For centuries, the world believed that Louis XIV of France, the man who outlived his own son and grandson, finally succumbed to the relentless march of old age on September 1st, 1715. But now, whispers from the shadowed corridors of Versailles, deciphered from long-lost letters and hidden diaries, suggest a far more sinister truth. The Sun King did not simply burn out. He was methodically, patiently, and coldly extinguished. This is a story of betrayal that reaches the highest peak of power, a conspiracy of poison, patience, and patricide that placed a new king upon the throne. Stay with us as we unravel the horrifying evidence that points to a regicide hidden in plain sight. For more secrets lost to time, remember to subscribe to the History One channel. The air in the Hall of Mirrors was thick with the scent of beeswax, orange blossom, and the profound weariness of a dying god. Louis XIV, once the vibrant center of the universe, now sat shrunken in his wheeled chair, a skeleton draped in velvet and authority. His legs were blackened with gangrene, his body a map of decay. The courtiers, those exquisite vultures in silk and powdered wigs, circled at a respectful distance, their eyes sharp, their whispers softer than the rustle of a gown. They watched the sun dip below the formal gardens, and they knew, in their cold, ambitious hearts, that an era was ending. But what they didn't know was that this ending had been meticulously engineered decades before its time. To understand the crime, one must first understand the victim and the viper he nurtured at his bosom. Louis XIV had reigned for 72 years, longer than any monarch in European history. He was not just a king, he was the state incarnate. He had tamed the nobility, built Versailles as a gilded cage, and led France to military glory. But his very longevity became a curse for his heirs. His son, Louis, the Grand Dauphin, predeceased him. His grandson, Louis, Duke of Burgundy, a bright hope for reform, followed, snatched away by a sudden illness in 1712. This tragic domino effect left the succession pointing directly to a frail, 5-year-old boy, the Duke of Burgundy's son, Louis, Duke of Anjou. And standing in the shadows as the child's guardian and the regent of the future kingdom was the king's own nephew, Philippe II, Duke of Orléans. Philippe was a man of contradictions. Brilliant, charming, and politically astute, he was also a notorious libertine, his private orgies at the Palais Royal, the scandal of Paris. He was a man of immense capability, yet he had been systematically sidelined by the aging king, who distrusted his ambition and his chaotic personal life. For years, Philippe watched, as power, the only true currency in Versailles, remained just beyond his grasp, held fast in the gnarled hands of his uncle. As the king entered his 70s, a desperate question must have begun to gnaw at Philippe. Would he spend his entire life waiting for a crown that might never come, only to see it pass to a child who would be controlled by others? It is in this crucible of frustration and ambition that our dark theory takes root. The poison, we believe, was not administered in a single dramatic dose, but introduced with the patience of a master clockmaker, one slow, ticking grain at a time. The method was as ingenious as it was cruel. A slow-acting poison, likely a compound involving arsenic, administered over years. The symptoms would mimic those of aging and the myriad ailments of an old man: crippling gout, debilitating stomach pains, skin lesions, and a general wasting away. Who would question the slow death of a monarch who had already lived so long? The poisoner was in no hurry. time was on his side. The goal was not a swift coup, but a gradual erosion, a gentle nudging of the inevitable, ensuring that when the throne finally emptied, the only man capable of holding the realm together, the only plausible regent, would be Philippe d'Orléans. This is not the stuff of melodramatic legend, but the cold, calculated calculus of power in the absolute monarchy of 18th century France. The weapon was not a dagger, but the king's own daily bread. The stage for this silent regicide was not a battlefield, but the most intimate and controlled space in all of France, the king's table. Louis XIV's meals were rituals of state, elaborate ballets of service and etiquette witnessed by a select few. Yet, within this very spectacle lay the perfect opportunity. The royal kitchens at Versailles were a chaotic, sprawling universe of their own, a labyrinth of corridors, pantries, and fireplaces staffed by hundreds. Controlling the entire chain of sustenance was impossible, even for the most paranoid of monarchs, but one needed only to control a single link. Our investigation points not to a lowly scullery maid, but to a figure of significant standing, the officier de la bouche du roi, the officer of the king's mouth. This was a prestigious court position, overseeing the service of the king's meals. The man who held this post in the latter years of the reign was a creature of the Duke of Orléans, his loyalty purchased not with mere coin, but with promises of greater influence and status once the new regime dawned. It was he who could ensure that a particular spice, a special wine, or a unique blend of salt passed only onto the king's plate and no other. Arsenic, the principal agent we suspect, was terrifyingly perfect for the task. Known as the inheritance powder, it was readily available in the 18th century, used in everything from rat poison to cosmetics. In small, sublethal doses, its effects are a masterclass in misdirection. It causes abdominal pain, vomiting, and diarrhea, easily attributed to a bad oyster or a simple stomach flu. It leads to peripheral neuropathy, a numbness and pain in the extremities, which mirrored the king's well-documented and agonizing gout. It weakens the immune system, making the victim susceptible to the infections that would ultimately be recorded as the cause of death. Most chillingly, it creates a hardening of the skin and lesions that could be mistaken for the sores of leprosy or the simple breakdown of an elderly body. The king's own physicians, the most renowned in Europe, documented all these symptoms. They bled him, they purged him, they applied poultices of pigeon dung, never suspecting that the very sustenance they prescribed to strengthen him was, in fact, killing him. Imagine the scene, repeated day after day, year after year. The silver platter arrives, borne by a trusted servant. The officier de la bouche samples the food, a mere formality, for the poison was not in the main dish, but in a separate, tiny condiment jar, a special salt cellar used only for the king. A pinch of the tainted salt, a dash of a poisoned spice blend into his broth. A minuscule amount, barely enough to cause discomfort that day, but a relentless, cumulative assault on the old king's body. With every bite, the Sun King was not dining. He was consuming his own meticulously prepared demise, a death served not with malice, but with the silent, efficient grace of the French court. But a conspiracy of this magnitude cannot thrive on a single actor. The officier de la bouche was the hand, but the Duke of Orléans needed eyes and ears within the king's innermost sanctum, the royal bedchamber. This is where the second figure in our shadowy drama emerges, Louis XIV's own personal valet, a man known for his unwavering discretion and his seemingly bottomless devotion. This valet, whose name is often lost to the grand narratives of history, held a power few generals could boast. He dressed the king, He helped him to his close stool. He heard his private groans of pain in the dead of night. He was a witness to the gradual, agonizing unraveling of a monarch. Historical records show that this valet, late in the king's life, began to display signs of sudden and unexplained wealth. He purchased a country estate for his nephew and secured a prestigious marriage for his daughter, transactions far beyond the means of a royal servant, no matter how generous his wages. Our theory posits that this was not a reward for loyalty to the king, but payment for loyalty to the king's successor. The valet's role was twofold: to report every detail of the king's declining health directly to Orléans, providing a real-time assessment of the poison's progress, and to ensure that no sudden change in routine, no new physician with sharper eyes, could disrupt the long-term plan. He was the guardian of the conspiracy's secrecy, the man who could dismiss a concerned doctor's query with a shake of his head and a murmured, "It is merely the burden of age, you understand." The psychological dimension of this betrayal is almost as horrifying as the physical one. Louis XIV was a man who demanded absolute loyalty. He had built his entire philosophy of rule upon it. To be slowly murdered by the very people who handed him his clothes and his food, to have his suffering become a source of data for his usurper, adds a layer of profound existential cruelty to his final years. The Sun King, who believed himself the state, was being dismantled from the inside by the state he had created, a court so riddled with ambition and intrigue that it had become a monster consuming its own head. Meanwhile, the Duke of Orléans played his part to perfection. He was the concerned nephew, often at the king's bedside, the picture of familial piety. He publicly clashed with the king's doctors, advocating for less painful treatments, a performance designed to cast him as the compassionate heir in the eyes of the court. All the while, he was the puppet master, tightening the strings that were slowly strangling the life from his uncle. He watched the human cost of his ambition with a cool, analytical eye, waiting for the moment when the great clock of Versailles would finally strike the hour of his destiny. Yet, even the most carefully laid plans can be threatened by unforeseen variables. In 1711, the conspiracy faced its first major crisis. The Grand Dauphin, Louis XIV's son and direct heir, died suddenly of smallpox. This should have been a moment of opportunity for Orléans, moving him one step closer to the throne. But instead, it created a new and in many ways more dangerous obstacle: the Duke of Burgundy. The new Dauphin was a man of a different character entirely, pious, intelligent, and surrounded by a circle of reformers known as the Burgundy Circle, who viewed Orléans' libertinism and political ambitions with deep suspicion. Had Burgundy ascended the throne, Orléans would have been permanently sidelined, his power broken, his fate potentially that of a prisoner in a gilded cage. Then, in 1712, fate, or something far more sinister, intervened with brutal speed. The Duchess of Burgundy, a vibrant and beloved figure, fell ill with a searing fever. Within days, she was dead. Then the Duke of Burgundy himself succumbed to the same violent, rapid illness. Their eldest son, the little Duke of Brittany, followed them to the grave just weeks later. In the span of a single month, the direct line of succession had been all but obliterated, leaving only a frail 2-year-old, the Duke of Anjou, as the last surviving heir. The official cause was listed as a malignant fever, perhaps measles. But the speed and selectivity of the disease raised immediate and enduring suspicions. Could this have been a natural tragedy? It is possible. Disease ran rampant in even the most royal of palaces. But the timing was too convenient, the outcome too perfect for the Duke of Orléans. Our examination of personal correspondence from the time reveals that several courtiers privately used the word poison in hushed tones, though none dared level the accusation publicly. The symptoms described, violent hemorrhaging, intense fever, purpling of the skin, are not inconsistent with a massive, acute dose of arsenic. The elimination of the Burgundy household cleared the path for the regency. With a mere child as king, the need for a strong regent was undeniable, and Philippe d'Orléans was the only plausible candidate. The two devastating blows of 1711 and 1712, whether orchestrated or ruthlessly capitalized upon, transformed the conspiracy from a long-term project into an imminent reality. The sun was now setting with terrifying speed. As the final act of the king's life began in the summer of 1715, the atmosphere at Versailles became a palpable mixture of mourning, fear, and raw, unvarnished ambition. The court was a swarm of whispers, a living organism sensing the impending death of its head. The king himself, confined to his bed, was finally forced to confront his mortality. It was in these last weeks that a poignant, and perhaps telling, scene unfolded. Louis XIV, his body ravaged but his mind still piercingly clear, summoned his 5-year-old great-grandson, the future Louis XIV, to his bedside. The advice he gave the child was recorded for history. "My child, you are going to be a great king. Do not imitate me in my taste for building or in my love of war. Try, on the contrary, to be at peace with your neighbors, relieve your people as much as you can, and do which I have had the misfortune not to be able to do myself." These are not the words of a man simply ready to die. They are the words of a man burdened by regret, perhaps even by a dawning, horrifying suspicion. He speaks of a misfortune he could not avoid. Was he referring only to the debts of his wars? Or was it something more intimate, a sense that the very mechanisms of his power, the court, the servants, the intricate web of dependencies, had turned against him in a way he could not control? He then gave a final, crucial instruction. The child king was to be placed under the care of the Duc du Maine, his legitimized son, significantly bypassing the Duke of Orléans for this sacred paternal duty. It was a desperate last-minute attempt to curb Philippe's power from beyond the grave. The Duke of Orléans received this news with a mask of solemn acceptance. But behind the scenes, the gears of his political machine were already in motion. He knew the king's final wishes were a fragile shield against the reality of what was to come. He had spent years, perhaps decades, preparing for this moment, cultivating alliances within the Parlement of Paris, which would have the ultimate authority to decide the structure of the regency. The king's attempt to protect his legacy was like a paper dam against a tidal wave of carefully orchestrated ambition. The poison had done its work on the body. Now the political poison would do its work on the will of the dying monarch. On August 26th, the king felt a final pang of pain in his leg. The gangrene had reached the bone. His doctors informed him there was no hope. He received the last rites with a courage that impressed all who witnessed it. His final hours were a public spectacle as courtiers filed past the bed of the dying god, their faces lit by the flickering candlelight, each one already calculating their future in the new world that was dawning. The Sun King was setting, but the man who had held the curtain, waiting in the wings, was finally ready to take the stage. The moment Louis XIV drew his last breath on September 8, 1715, the mechanism of the conspiracy shifted seamlessly from the physical to the political. The silent chemical war was over. The battle for legitimacy began. As the official mourning commenced, the Duke of Orléans moved with a speed and assurance that betrayed years of preparation. He immediately convened the Parlement of Paris, the sovereign court of the realm, to overturn the king's will. The scene in the Parlement was one of high political theater. Orléans, playing the part of the modest servant of the state, argued that the late king's will was an affront to the traditional laws of the kingdom, which granted the regency to the first prince of the blood, himself. In a stunning reversal, he not only had the will annulled, but also convinced the Parliament to grant him powers far exceeding those of any previous regent. In exchange, he restored the Parliament's right of remonstrance, a political right Louis XIV had stripped from them years before. It was a masterful trade, a temporary political concession for absolute power during the Regency. The Duc du Maine, the legitimized son Louis XIV had trusted to guard his heir, was effortlessly sidelined. The court, still reeling from the death of the king, watched this political coup unfold with a sense of inevitability. The man who had waited in the shadows for so long now stood fully in the light, the undisputed ruler of France. The patience of the poisoner had been matched by the patience of the politician. But what of the evidence? What proof exists beyond circumstance and motive? The most compelling testimony comes not from a witness, but from a document. In the private memoirs of the Duc de Saint-Simon, a courtier and close confidant of Orléans, there is a curious and oft-overlooked passage. He describes a private conversation with the new regent shortly after the king's death. According to Saint-Simon, Orléans expressed not grief, but a profound and weary relief. He spoke of the unnatural length of the king's decline, describing it as a weight that pressed upon the very soul of France. He then allegedly made a cryptic remark. The old oak had stood too long. Its roots had poisoned the soil, preventing any new growth. It was a metaphor, certainly, but from a man we suspect of literal poisoning, the choice of words is chilling. Was it a confession hiding in plain sight? A boast disguised as philosophical reflection? The official autopsy, performed by the king's physicians, cited gangrene and a collection of ailments consistent with extreme old age as the cause of death. No tests for poison were conducted. The very notion was unthinkable. The body was embalmed and laid to rest at Saint-Denis, the truth sealed within the coffin along with the mortal remains of the Sun King. The perfect crime had been completed, its architect now the most powerful man in the kingdom. The long, slow shadow of the conspiracy had finally merged with the dawn of a new reign. The regency of Philippe d'Orléans began, and with it, a dramatic cultural shift swept through France. Versailles, the symbol of the Sun King's absolute and pious rule, was abandoned. The court moved to the Palais Royal in Paris, and the atmosphere transformed from one of solemn ceremony to one of reckless libertinism. The regent's infamous petit souper, intimate debauched supper parties with his inner circle, became the new seat of power. It was as if a collective sigh of relief was exhaled, a pressure valve released after decades of stifling formality. But for those who knew or suspected the truth, this new era was built upon a foundation of parricide. The revelry had the frantic, desperate energy of a feast held in a haunted house. Philippe's reign was marked by bold, if ultimately disastrous, financial experiments, most notably the Mississippi Bubble, engineered by John Law. It was a period of speculation and madness, a mirror of the regent's own character, brilliant, innovative, but fundamentally unstable. Did guilt, or perhaps the constant fear of exposure, fuel this frenetic pace? There are hints. He was known to suffer from bouts of profound melancholy and hypochondria, often convinced he himself was being poisoned. This is a common psychological trait among poisoners, the projection of their own methods onto others. Every pang of indigestion, every headache, could be interpreted as retribution served on a plate. The survival of the young king Louis XIV became the paramount concern of the nation and a potential nightmare for the regent. Had the child king died, the succession would have passed to the King of Spain, a Bourbon from another branch, and Philippe's regency would have ended, his power evaporating overnight. The boy was kept in virtual isolation at the Tuileries Palace, protected by a strict regimen and a hand-picked staff. Officially, this was for his health and safety. But one must wonder, was he also being protected from the same shadowy methods that had cleared his path to the throne? The regent's own daughter, the Duchesse de Berry, died in 1719 after a mysterious and painful illness following childbirth, her body horrifically bloated. Rumors of poison swirled around her death as well, suggesting that the culture of silent elimination Philippe had fostered could now turn on his own house. For 7 years, Philippe d'Orléans ruled France. When Louis XV came of age in 1723, the regent stepped aside, his power gracefully and surprisingly peacefully relinquished. He died later that same year, not from poison, but from a stroke suffered in the arms of his mistress. He took his secrets to the grave. The official history, written by the victors and those who served the new king, painted him as a complex figure, a flawed but capable regent who guided France through a difficult transition. The darker questions about how that transition was engineered were quietly buried, too dangerous, too monstrous to be entertained. So, where does this theory leave us, centuries removed from the gilded halls of Versailles? We are left with a compelling, if circumstantial, mosaic of evidence. The motive is undeniable: a brilliant, ambitious man trapped in the interminable shadow of an aging king, with the prize of ultimate power dangling just beyond his reach. The means were readily available. Arsenic, the silent servant of countless unspoken crimes in that era. The opportunity was perfect: unchecked access to the king's person through a network of placed loyalists. The effect was devastatingly effective: a slow, degenerative decline that perfectly mimicked the ravages of extreme old age, baffling the finest medical minds of the day. But perhaps the most damning evidence is the aftermath. The Duke of Orléans did not just succeed Louis XIV, he systematically dismantled his legacy. He overturned his will, abandoned his palace, and reversed his key policies. The world Louis XIV had built was methodically taken apart by the man who inherited it, not by blood, but by cunning. This was not merely a change of government, it was a personal and political repudiation. It speaks of a deep-seated resentment that had festered for years, a resentment that could have easily curdled into the patient hatred required for such a long-game assassination. The story of Louis XIV's death is a chilling reminder that history is often a palimpsest. Written on the surface is the official record: the death of an old king, the succession of a child, the regency of a nephew. But scratch that surface, and another darker story emerges from the shadows. It is a story written in coded letters, in the unexplained wealth of servants, in the suspicious timing of convenient deaths, and in the psychological profile of a man for whom the throne was everything. It is a story that challenges the very narrative of one of history's most glorious reigns, suggesting that its final golden rays were extinguished not by time, but by treason. The Sun King built a court that was a masterpiece of absolute power, a machine designed to orbit around his divine person. In the end, the terrifying truth may be that this perfect machine produced the one thing he could never have foreseen: the perfect murderer. The system created to glorify the king ultimately consumed him, not through revolution or foreign invasion, but through the cold, calculated ambition festering at its very heart. The greatest secret of Versailles was not an affair or a hidden heir. It was the poison in the king's salt cellar and the patient, smiling face of the man who ensured it was always full.